Thanks to our hosts here at George Washington University. My name is Craig Aaron. I'm the president and CEO of Free Press. For those who may not know, Free Press is an organization that fights for your rights to connect and to communicate. We are a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit group devoted to advancing the public interest on issues surrounding media, technology, and democracy. Honored to be here tonight with two of our founders, Bob McChesney and John Nichols, and to celebrate the publication of this excellent new book, Dollarocracy, which is for sale in the hallway, and they'll be signing afterwards, so be sure to get your copy. I want to thank our allies at Common Cause, at The Nation and Nation Books, publisher of this fine book, Demand Progress, the Sunlight Foundation, and the Institute for Policy Studies for helping to get the word out tonight. You know, it really wasn't that long ago that I was sitting in the audience, perhaps like many of you. Okay, it was 15 years ago when I heard Bob McChesney and John Nichols speak for the first time. I was a young journalist in Chicago. I was a progressive, and pretty soon the only word I could find for it was gobsmacked by what they had to say, because Bob McChesney and John Nichols connected the dots for me as someone who cares about the media, as someone who believed in democracy, and as someone who was trying to stay positive about what this country and its people could accomplish. I think they're partly defined by an unshakable optimism, a faith in the power of the people, even in the face of all the disturbing history and sobering statistics that you'll find in this book, even in the face of the powerful and mendacious opponents who are trying to turn our democracy into a dollarocracy, that underlying optimism still really sticks with you. And they have a great way of providing these aha moments, saying the thing that you always believed, only maybe you didn't know it until right then. And they've never been afraid to push the big ideas that stretch Washington's hopelessly narrow vision of what's possible, simply because the solutions they came up with were the best ones to the problems in front of them. They've never been afraid to demand the impossible, and I think we need more of that for sure. Bob and John taught me that the media system we have isn't magical, it's not natural, it's the result of political and policy and business decisions. And just because historically the public has been left out of all those decisions doesn't mean that things have to stay that way. That's why they started Free Press, and we're about to celebrate our 10th anniversary later this year. We believed that when people understood that they had the fundamental right to change the broken and corrupted media system, that millions of them would actually try to do it. And we were right about that. Honestly, though, if you'd asked us, I think, 10 years ago to predict what the next decade would look like, so much of what we've actually accomplished would have seemed impossible or unthinkable. We started with Bob McChesney's personal email list, and now we've got an army of 600,000 activists. We went from a few people huddled in a tiny apartment in Western Massachusetts to a team of 36 dedicated organizers, creative campaigners, sharp legal minds, and influential advocates. And we took once obscure issues like media consolidation and net neutrality and made them national concerns that were talked about in the press, that were talked about by the president, and that were talked about around kitchen tables too. And we've challenged some of the most powerful institutions and biggest companies in Washington. And I think we've won a lot more than anyone expected. And at our 10-year anniversary, we want to celebrate those victories. But the truth really is that it's not enough. It's not enough because the reality is that 10 years later, the media, for most people, it's not really better. It's not enough. Policymaking is still dominated by giant companies and influence peddlers. Journalism is still in crisis. Public and community media are still starved for support. It's not enough. The open internet is still under attack. The surveillance state surpasses some of our worst nightmares. So we know what we've done so far isn't enough. And so, as Bob and John argue in this book, this is not the time to tinker around the edges. It's not the time to get lost in the weeds. It's not the time to settle for those compromises on capitulations because they're the best we can get right now. It's time to think bigger. It's time to be bolder in our prescriptions because the problems that are in front of us are not small ones. And it's time to create and seize a moment of reform. I think it's time to break down those silos between the media reform community and the campaign finance reform community and the election reform community, because we're all in the same fight. I mean, we're fighting against this media money election complex that Bob and John write so eloquently about. And those guys, our enemies, are already working together, but we're not. And if you want a democracy and not a dollarocracy, we have to start working together. If you want that democracy and not a dollarocracy, you're in the right place. You came to the right event tonight. I do have a book you should read. And if you want that democracy and not a dollarocracy, we need your help in the fight. Free Press is a people-powered organization. So if you haven't yet signed up to be a member of Free Press, I would urge you to take out this one of these devices if you have one, or Luddites, use your pencils, and go to freepress.net. Sign up. Join our list. We'll tell you when important things are happening. Take action on one of our campaigns to save the open and uncensored internet, to stop unchecked NSA spying, to defend press freedom, and to bring much-needed transparency to the political attack ads that are flooding our airwaves. And better yet, I hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. At Free Press, we don't take a dime from companies, political parties, or the government. We rely on our members. We rely on you. And I promise that we will put any money to work immediately for your rights to connect and communicate. So, I don't know about you, but it hasn't even really started yet, and I'm already feeling optimistic. That's it. But now on to the main event. So are you ready to be gobsmacked? It's a callback.
Yes.
All right, there we go. Well, great. Well, then please join me in welcoming the pride of Madison, Wisconsin, two gentlemen I have learned a great deal from, and I'm still learning. I finished the book on the plane from Houston today. Two great Americans, Bob McChesney and John Nichols, or at least Bob McChesney.
I qualify as two great Americans probably for my width, but all right, thank you all. Great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Bernie Sanders for giving my speech. Wasn't that a great talk he gave? He covered basically most of the points. Why don't we just go sign some books? And Craig, your introduction was wonderful too. You hit the points Bernie missed, so that was nice. You know, we're very lucky to have Bernie Sanders. I think everyone knows that. To speak so honestly, you know, one sentence from Bernie Sanders about how Congress works equals 500 volumes of BS from everyone else in every political science department in the country. You know, just getting Bernie crystallizing, this is how it actually works, guys. And we know that. American people know that. They really do. The research shows that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I also want to thank Craig Aaron for the introduction, which was very kind and very flattering. I'm not sure it's exactly true, but I'll take it. You know, Free Press is something that John and I helped start with Josh Silver. Well, it was really 11 years ago at this point. And it started, interestingly enough, I think the motor force for it was that in April of 2002, Bernie asked John and I to come to Vermont to do 3 town meetings with him to discuss corporate control of the media and the problems it meant in society. And we went to Montpelier on a Sunday night, Burlington on a Monday night, and then down to the southern part, Brattleboro, I think it is? I can't even remember. Somewhere in the southern part of Vermont. Frank, you're the Vermontan, is that right? Brattleboro. So Brattleboro on Tuesday night. And every room was packed to the gills. It had people hanging from the rafters. And Bernie said he'd never seen anything like this in his entire career. He's just town meetings all the time on every possible issue. He'd never seen such enthusiasm. And the questions we got from people in the audience were astonishingly smart. So much smarter than the questions I hear from, oh, this is being recorded, isn't it? I always get in trouble with these things, but from, let's say, people who work in my profession. I'll just leave it at that. And I was so astounded, and I said, and John and I left that after talking to Bernie. We said, you know, there's something going on here. there's an untapped energy and interest and enthusiasm about having a media system that actually empowers people to be effective citizens and participate in politics rather than manipulate them for whatever reasons. And that people get it. They understand how important that is. And that's really, I think, that experience was what gave the fuel to both John and me to get together with Josh, start Free Press. Craig was right in on the ground floor. I mean, shortly after starting, Craig came aboard the team. And we're incredibly proud of everything he does. And one of the nicest things for me is to come to Washington like I did today. And even tonight, right before we came in tonight, people are coming up to me, oh, Bob, you did a great job on this or that, something Free Press has done in the last 5 years. And I have to say, look, I'm on the board, but I didn't do any of that. And I'm getting all the credit for this stuff. And so, you know, I'm going to stop saying I don't get the credit. I'll just soak it up and accept it from now on. But it's well earned to deserve the praise that Free Press gets, the work they're doing under, as Bernie Sanders lays out, and as we lay out in this book, and I think most people in this room know, it's difficult to do progressive public interest work in this town. You know, the playing field is not level. In fact, it's a heck of a lot closer to this than it is to this. It's a difficult criteria. You've got to be willing to dig in, have the long view, be patient, but never back down either. And those people who do it, and there are a lot in this room, not just Free Press, you have my unending respect and admiration. So thank you for what you're doing. Please keep it up. Yeah, thank you. I'll just say a few words about the book, and being a college professor, we'll be done around 11. First of all, what do we mean by Dollarocracy? Well, I think Bernie answered that one for us. You know, democracy is the rule of the people, the demos. In fact, Aristotle said democracy is the rule of the poor, because there are always more poor people than there are wealthy people. So that's how he understood it. Dollarocracy is the rule of the dollars, the rule of money. Instead of one person, one vote, we have $1, one vote. Money rules, not the will of the people. Former President Jimmy Carter, I think some of you might have seen the story, over the summer was talking with Germans about the state of the world in politics. And he said in passing that the United States today is, quote, no longer a functional democracy. The United States is off the democratic grid. It's no longer what it once was. It is no longer an accountable, functional democracy. And Bernie just said that to you in his comments. He said, nothing can get passed in Congress that Wall Street or corporate America opposes. Nothing. And you know what Bernie said there was actually confirmed by two of the leading studies done in the political science realm in the last 2 years that have been published by Princeton University Press. Two independent studies done by leading political scientists came to the exact same conclusion. And the conclusion was this. They said, on every major government decision of policy dealing with regulation, taxation, economics, foreign policy, the budget, the environment, the works, the interest, values, opinion, concerns of the bottom 90 or 95% of the population have absolutely no influence whatsoever. If you want to understand how political decisions are made in America, you have to look at the very top. That's where the decisions get made. This is what the leading political scientists have found. This is what Bernie talked about. And interestingly enough, this is what most Americans get. The polling shows that. Most Americans understand that. We go through some of the polling in the book, in Dollarocracy, and I don't remember the exact number. Maybe you remember it, John. But at one of the surveys said, do you think it'd be better to continue to have elections or to have members of Congress selected like jury style out of the phone book? Which would be a better system? And just save the $10 billion, just grab a name out of a hat and say, okay, you're senator. And it's an astonishingly high number. I feel like 53% said jury system out of the phone book. Just grab some names out of the hat. It would be better than going through this monstrosity of these money-drenched elections. That's the situation we're facing. And you know, it's really not an irrational response. And once you read my book, you might increase the percentage by 1 or 2 when you see how it's done. And there are real problems with this system, with this Dollarocracy, to put it mildly. One of the problems with it is you get what are called zombie ideas. This is a term John coined and we're using in the book. Zombie ideas refer to ideas that have been roundly rejected by the American people whenever they're given a chance to weigh in on them. And in the surveys and polls, they always are. But they never die. They never die because there are powerful interests behind them. Now, if these were ideas that there were no powerful interests behind, they'd be dead and buried generations ago. What are some of the zombie ideas? Cutting Social Security. Zombie idea. No, people don't like that idea. It's a clunker. But boy, that one keeps coming back. It never dies because Pete Peterson and his pals and all that crowd want to privatize it. They want to get rid of it. It will always be an issue. Cutting Social Security. Getting rid of Medicare, privatizing it, voucherizing it. Zombie idea. Even the Tea Party slogan was keep the government's hands off Medicare. Even they liked it. But it never dies, no matter how popular it is. Not having trade unions. Surveys show that the majority of private sector workers would like the right to have trade unions. They would enjoy that opportunity. But it's virtually impossible to start a private sector trade union for the last 3 decades in the United States, despite the fact that people like that idea. Well, getting rid of labor unions, not having effective enforcement of labor laws or having labor laws that would make it easier to start private sector trade unions, these are a zombie idea. Not popular, but it's still there. I could go on and on. In fact, I've got a list of about 14, but I'm not going to go any further. I think you get the drift there. And this dollarocracy has consequences. It can't go on forever. It's not an abstract matter. It's not a debating society issue. It's not just sort of interesting thing like the outcome of a football match. It has real consequences. The obvious one we see immediately is the corruption of the governing system and the cynicism and the apathy that logically grow out of it, which is cancerous to the health of a free society. Likewise, what you see with it and connected to it closely is growing poverty. And Bernie talked about the staggering poverty we're seeing in America now and the tremendous amount of inequality that comes with dollarocracy and which comes with this corruption. In the United States in the last generation, we've seen an incredible increase of economic inequality. Virtually all the gains in income in the last generation have gone to the top 1 or 2%. The rest of the population, especially the bottom 2/3, has been stagnant or now declining. It used to be the United States, a generation ago, when I was the age of the students today, was by comparison, similar to other Western European nations, a fairly egalitarian place with a sense of advancement for people who were able to go to college and worked hard and took care of themselves. Not so today. Not so today. There's a Gini index that's used by sociologists and economists to measure inequality in nations. It's a standard tool that's used across the world. The United States used to have a score that put it there with Germany and France and all the countries of Europe and Japan. Today, our Gini index number is closer to that found in Malaysia and the Philippines. We're off the democratic grid. We're no longer in the same place as other democracies. And it's the result of dollarocracy. If you have a dollarocracy and a policy set up for those at the top, you're going to have a society where most of the resources of the society flow to those at the top. That's how the system works. In our book, we really focus on elections and the election system. Because elections have always been an especially important part of a democratic system. They're the one time, as Bernie said, when the Bill Gateses, the Walmart heirs, and some hedge fund billionaire on Wall Street has the exact same amount of power as the woman who cleans the latrines at Walmart from midnight to 6 a.m. They have the exact same amount of power. They have 1 vote each. And for that reason, the Walmart heirs and the hedge fund billionaires have always been scared to death of elections. That's why all the property owners going back to the beginning of the Republic have looked upon elections as a very scary phenomenon. And that's one of the reasons why when this country began, only 6% of adults were eligible to vote, and they tended to be these sort of people. And we've had battle after battle after battle all the way into the 1970s to expand it so every adult over 18 could vote. And it was a series of some of the most important political battles in our country. And in those battles, these guys, these owners, almost always were on the opposite side of the barricades, almost always opposed it. They said, no, we don't want to expand it. And it was always a pitched political fight. I think the last time we finally got full universal adult suffrage in America in the early 1970s. It took us that long to become a modern liberal democracy, an effective one. And it's somewhat of, maybe not a coincidence, that that's the moment that really our history has changed and really took a sharp turn. And we chronicle this turn in the book. Because I think if you looked at America in the early 1970s, and I remember this period very well because it was so different, it was a different type of country. And to people who ran businesses in America then, CEOs of corporations, they looked out across America in 1970 or 71, and they didn't like what they saw. They didn't like the way the world was looking. Who was the most respected person in America by polling in America in 1970 or 1971? Who was the one that young Americans thought was the best person in the country? Ralph Nader. Where did business stand, corporations stand in public opinion polls at that time? Very low in estimation. They were held in very low regard. Business in general was not seen as being such a wonderful institution. It was seen as monopolistic, inefficient, corrupt, gunking up the works, not a progressive force. And this really concerned the traditional owners of society and business. And they went to one of the leading corporate lawyers in America at the time, a Virginia lawyer who represented the tobacco industry, and they said, will you help us with this? And this was the Chamber of Commerce that made this commission. They spoke to a gentleman named Lewis Powell. And Lewis Powell agreed to write a memorandum on how big business could deal with this crisis. It's called the Powell Memo. We have a chapter on it in the book, and you can Google it and you'll see it. It's a short memo, but it's really, I think in a civics class of America today, it should be read along with the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, a few other things as central documents to understanding the political development of our country. Because what Lewis Powell did in that short memo, addressed a private memo just for corporate CEOs and billionaires, or the 100 millionaires. In that memo, what he said is, the problem in America today is that people who traditionally are apathetic and traditionally don't get in the way of governance are getting uppity. You know, we've got blacks and women and students and young people suddenly making demands on the system, and the system isn't meant for that. They should be on the couch. They should be quiet. What we have to do in America today is reassert the dominance of business in politics. We have to have the business community's got to take over the government again. It's got to rule the government. It's got to get where Bernie Sanders says it is today. That's where he wanted to get. And we have to do this in a multi-front fight. Immediately after that memo was written, in the next decade, and it was widely distributed and talked about, immediately after that happened, we saw a tenfold increase begin in corporate lobbyists in Washington, D.C. A tenfold increase in corporate lobbyists. Almost all the major trade associations of American industry, it used to be the automobiles would be based in Detroit, glass in Toledo, rubber in Akron, steel in Pittsburgh, all moved their headquarters to Washington, D.C. The heads of these trade associations were no longer experts in the industry. They didn't know anything about that. They were experts in politics, experts in lobbying. And we had this enormous lobbying armada put into place as a result of this new trend. We also saw a real sharp concern with higher education, making it more open to big business as a legitimate force. Media, making it more sensitive to the needs of big business. And Lewis Powell himself said we have to also make sure the court system, stop being stocked by these idealistic types and get people running on our court system. We're going to be more sympathetic to the needs of business and profit. Who would be a good person to put on the courts if you want someone who's going to be especially sympathetic to the needs of business? How about Lewis Powell? And guess what? A couple months after the memo's done, he is appointed and approved to be put on the U.S. Supreme Court, becomes a justice. And even though this memo was known already in certain circles, this did not come up in his confirmation hearings, which is really much more of a coronation, as he won by a vote of 99-1 in the U.S. Senate. And once Powell got to the U.S. Supreme Court, he was called a moderate because he was a Southerner who wasn't a member of the Klan, which is sort of the criteria to be a moderate in those days. And but his number one pet issue from the moment he got on the Supreme Court was to have unlimited spending on elections by rich people and corporations. He fought for that. He pushed for that. It was a central concern of his because he understood that if you can buy an election, you know, the good guys, in his view, would win. It would stack the deck on your side. It would give you the results you wanted to get. He thought that was a crucial issue. With Citizens United, in many respects, a generation of changes saw that his dream was fulfilled. Citizens United allowed unlimited money, and although it doesn't call for it in the decision, it made possible the creation of groups that could make the money largely unaccountable, which we chronicle in the book. And it overturned a century of law that had been passed. It was really legislative work. The court basically assumed a legislative duty that was extraordinary, huge, and if not unprecedented, certainly striking. And as a result, we saw in the 2012 election $10 billion spent on the election, almost twice what was spent just 4 years earlier, $10 billion, and 10 times what was spent 2 decades ago. And you're saying, well, gosh, we spend that much money, we must have great elections. You know, put all those resources into it, it must be really a great election system. Poor Norway and Sweden and Germany, they only spend 1/100th or 1/500th of what we do per capita. They must have terrible elections over in those countries. You know, because we spend so much more, we must have better elections, right? It's the exact opposite. They have much better elections. Their voter turnout rate is 65, 75, 80, 85%. Ours is 52% on a good day. Next year, it'll probably be 37 or 38% in the off-year elections. And you get away from a November even-year election, you're down in the 10 to 25% range for voter turnout. And those sort of numbers would be laughable in the countries I just mentioned that barely spend any money. But in America, we spend a fortune. And the confusion people have about the money that's spent on elections is pretty simple. A lot of people think, well, gee, I give money to candidates. I have values that I care about. I want to contribute. And so I personally give money. I bet a lot of the people in this room give money to candidates. It's a civic investment. It's part of being a citizen. But as Bernie Sanders put it, the people who are giving money, most of this $10 billion, and increasingly are going to be the dominant players, are not making civic investments. They're making civic donations to the culture. They're making investments with a commercial return expected. Now, most of the billionaires who are giving money, and multi-hundred millionaires and CEOs and that type who are giving the money in these campaigns prefer not to be known. They prefer to be anonymous for understandable reasons. They don't really want to draw attention to themselves, which sometimes makes it more difficult for us as scholars and more difficult for the few remaining journalists there are who cover this issue to get to the bottom of it. And there's a lot of important work to be done there. But fortunately for us, there's one dude from Las Vegas, Nevada, who revels in the spotlight, Shelley Adelson, who forked out $150 million last year trying to buy a bunch of elections. And everyone talks about, oh, poor Shelley, he lost the presidential race. Well, Shelley didn't lose everything. Shelley also was a prime spender to defeat the constitutional amendment in Michigan, which would make the right to organize part of the Constitution. And Shelley bankrolled the campaign to defeat that measure in Michigan. And he was very happy about that. And Shelley Adelson's a very interesting man, because he said in an interview right after the election, Shelley said, you know what, I'm a liberal guy. I'm for socialized medicine. I believe in a woman's right to choose. I believe in gay rights. I'm concerned about climate change. I believe in stem cell research. I'm a liberal guy. But when I make my donations, I don't care about that crap. I'm paraphrasing now. But not by much. He said, I don't care about that stuff. I hate labor unions. They get in the way of my business. I want to get rid of them. I don't want to pay taxes, and I don't want a government that's going to look too closely at my shady deals in Asia and might prosecute me. So that's why I'm investing for those three reasons. That's why I spent $150 million. Get rid of the unions, get rid of my taxes, and please don't look too closely at my affairs. That's because he's worth $32 billion, and he wants to be worth $60 billion. And that's a nice return for $150 million if you go from 30 to 60 billion. And if he doesn't win the election, he might go from 30 to 10 billion. And if we actually had a government that did the stuff Bernie would like to do, he might go from 30 to 0. But he would not be going the direction he wants to go. So these are investments. That's what this is all about. It leads us to the point where Jimmy Carter, the Carter Center, Jimmy Carter's Carter Center in Atlanta has gone in the last 25 years to 92 countries to investigate elections. And they're called into Venezuela and Belarus and, Azerbaijan. I mean, everywhere on earth that has a controversial election, the Carter Center's there to add up the numbers and make sure it's a legitimate election. And Jimmy Carter has said, the United States election system has gotten to the point now where he and the Carter Center would refuse to monitor one of our elections because we're so corrupt, we don't even hit the baseline that he requires of Azerbaijan before he'll go to monitor their election. That's the point we're at. He said the United States has arguably the worst election system in the world. Now, in our book, what we talk about, in addition to the money and Lewis Powell and the corporate campaign, is that this is every bit a media story. And this is the crucial point. Much of the book deals with the media aspect of this. For starters, if we had great journalism, if we had journalists who were covering the story closely, bringing people into the issues, the amount of money being spent wouldn't be that big of a deal because they couldn't buy an informed population. But what we've seen in the past generation is the collapse of journalism. Its disintegration as an institution in our society. It's a major theme in our previous work, and it's a major theme here. It's still, unfortunately, all too neglected. The reason for that is that the business community has decided you can't make money doing journalism. That's why Jeff Bezos can buy the Washington Post for what it would have sold, 5% of what it would have sold for a decade ago. And he bought it as a political investment, a Shelley Adelson investment, not as a commercial investment. That's why he didn't buy it through Amazon. And they've decided you can't make money. And the reason you can't make money, ultimately, and why they voted against it, is that with the internet coming along, the emergence of the internet, advertising is going through a fundamental revolution. It no longer buys a medium, pays the medium to get access to the visitors or the readers or the viewers, and then the medium uses some of the money to pay for content like journalism. Instead, the way digital advertising, what's called smart advertising, works is you buy through a network like Microsoft or Google or AOL, you buy a demographic. A corporation, a business says, we want 25 million women 18 to 24 who are in a market for this product, and they will go out and find 25 million women wherever they are on the web and place the ad at whatever website they're at. And the content-producing websites don't get a very little cut, if anything, as a result of that. And that's the future. That's happening right now. That's the future. That means the commercial model of journalism that has existed since the 1890s is dying and soon to be dead, and it's not coming back. Advertising is not coming back. It's a better way to accomplish its ends. And that is disastrous at every level for our society, but it's especially disastrous for elections and politics, the coverage of politics, because it means that most campaigns in America today have no coverage whatsoever. You go in to vote, you have no idea about anyone or anything. You have no concept of what the issues are in any particular race. You're going in blindfolded. You don't have a clue, and you're at the mercy then of money. Their power is accelerated. Now, there's some coverage, and I won't go into it much. We spend a chapter trashing it in the book. You'll find it very entertaining. We look at, how MSNBC and CNN and Fox and all the sort of horse race coverage where whoever's ahead in the polls is deemed a brilliant politician and gets good coverage. Who's ever behind in the polls is regarded as a moron because they're behind in the polls, gets bad coverage. It's a sort of coverage, frankly, that you could have in China today in a Politburo election. It's nutritionless coverage. It has nothing about the issues the society faces. It demeans us. So where does all this money go? Where does all this money go? $12 billion, $10 billion. Well, the most of it goes to political advertising. Political advertising was $6 billion. TV political advertising last time around, $6 billion. And of that $6 billion for political advertising, it almost all goes to local television stations, local commercial TV stations. And people take it for granted now that that's just the way it is in America. We've always had political advertising. That's how campaigns are done. And it reminds me of the great quote of Thomas Paine, the opening sentence to his, the book that launched the American Revolution, Common Sense, when he said, "A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it the superficial appearance of being correct." And that's really the way you would understand political advertising. An absurd, insulting practice that's outlawed in most democracies. It's not allowed to be done. But it's now our only real form of political communication, basic form of political communication. And when we studied this, what John and I were surprised to find was we knew political advertising was hated going back to the 60s and 70s, though it was a much smaller phenomenon on television. But we were surprised to find that back then it was almost all positive advertising about candidates. It would be Richard Nixon playing Frisbee with his dog. And it was a stupid ad, but it was about Richard Nixon. Or it'd be Jimmy Carter sticking his hand in the dirt in Plains, Georgia, and squeezing it to show he's a farmer. And it was a dumb ad, but it's about Jimmy Carter. What we've seen now, the great shift, and this has been accelerated by Citizens United, is that the percentage of ads that are now attack ads, attacking a candidate, has risen from just single digits back then to 50 or 60% by a decade ago, to this last election, post-Citizens United, in some races, virtually 100%. 80, 85, 90%, attack ad after attack ad after attack ad. There were twice as many ads in 2012 as there were in 2008 on TV. Twice as many. We have actually data in there for Washington, D.C., where they expanded the length of a news show by 15 minutes on one of the network affiliates so they could add 15 more minutes of political ads. Yeah, half hours. They have 50 more minutes of political ads. You have 20, 30 political ads in a row being shown together on news broadcasts. It's absolutely unbelievable. Now, people say, yeah, that's really stupid. Why would someone spend... I hate those ads. They say, no one could pay... Those ads can't work. These guys who spent $6 billion must be the biggest morons in America. What a waste of money. No one believes those ads. They don't work. What a bunch of losers these guys are. Well, it'd be nice to think that's the way it worked, but it's not that way at all, unfortunately. And part of the reason is there's a big difference between a commercial marketplace in a political race in a two-party system. In a commercial marketplace, if Pepsi gets 49.9% of the market share in colas, it could be one of the 3 or 4 wealthiest, richest, most profitable companies in the world. But if you're a political candidate, like our friend Mark Pocan here, he gets 49.9% of the vote in a two-party race, he's out of business, he's bankrupt, he's dead. He gets 50.1, it's winner take all, he's the king, he has the whole market. So for a political candidate to get from 49.9 to 50.1, that little bit, it's worth paying whatever you pay. And if your advertising can move the needle just enough to nudge you there, it's worth doing. And both sides do it, and you keep raising the stakes. The other depressing part of it is, with an absence of journalism, the research shows something even more scary. If you're they had focus groups where they convene people before the election, and they'd ask them, who are you going to vote for? And who aren't you going to vote for? And they talk to people, and what they find from people before the election, they say, oh, I hate those negative ads. Oh, those things are terrible. I will never vote for someone who does a negative ad. I'd like to see the dummies who think those ads are for real. You hear that all the time. That's what everyone says in these focus groups. That's what I'd say. I bet that's what most of you would say in a focus group. Then they convene the exact same people after the election. Say, who'd you vote for? Who didn't you vote for? And guess what they say when they ask them who you didn't vote for? They basically repeat almost verbatim the content of negative political ads. Almost verbatim. It's striking. The data is in. That stuff does work. They spend $6 billion on it for a reason. It moves the needle. And if you don't do it and your other opponent does do it, the needle moves back against you. So people have to do it. As a result of this, we found that commercial broadcasters have become the great winners of the media and money election complex. The average commercial television station 20 years ago got maybe 2 or 3% of its revenues from selling TV political ads. This last year, we don't have the final data in, but from what we look at individual markets, the average commercial television station in the United States last year, local commercial TV station, got between 20 and 40% of its revenues from selling political ads. This is an enormous gusher. I mean, this is Jed Clampett on steroids. I mean, this is like unbelievable gift to an industry. This is given to you, this sort of immense amount of money that they get. And the tragedy here, the shamelessness of it, is that these television stations receive their monopoly licenses from the government to have a television or radio station because they're supposed to be serving the public interest. And the courts have said, and the FCC has said at times, that the main or one of the main ways a commercial broadcaster can show its commitment to serving the public interest is by providing ample coverage of local political races. That's the one thing stations can do. Because that's the one thing we need from our stations, is to tell us who's running for these various positions, show us debates, give us information about them. And as this money train is increased up to 20 to 40%, the coverage, which is never that high, never much to begin with, and people have been complaining about forever, has basically disappeared. It just doesn't exist. And the FCC hasn't even tried to seriously enforce it. They can't enforce it. We go through the book, all sorts of stories about this, but I'm just going to give one. Former FCC head William Kennard was Bill Clinton's second FCC chair in the late 1990s. And when he came to office in 1997, Kennard was committed to getting free time for candidates on television. He was committed to having local stations fulfill their public service obligations so we could reduce the reliance on big money and make it easier for candidates to communicate without having to buy ads. He wanted debates to be shown in local races on television. That was his goal. And he'd go around the country and he'd give talks. And he would talk to audiences like this all over the country. Left, right, north, south, you call it. Everyone loved the idea. Everyone loved the idea of free airtime, of debates, of reducing those stupid ads and getting the money reduced in politics. And then Kennard said he came back to Washington and started floating that in, telling people, you wouldn't believe how much people love this idea. You get outside of Washington. He'd tell people that. And people looked at him like, he had a communicable disease. What are you talking about, Kennard? That's not an issue. And he found out how powerful the commercial broadcasting lobby was in this issue, that was their lifeline. You could not mess with that. And finally, and I interviewed Kennard, this is how I know the story, right after he left office, finally Kennard was pulled aside by a former Democratic head of the FCC and some other prominent Democrats. And they said, Kennard, Bill, they called him, Bill, you keep this up, it's going to end your political career. And it might mean we'll cut off funding, the Congress will cut off funding for the FCC, knock it off. And Kennard knocked it off. And he said, isn't it a shame that just merely trying to enforce the law that exists to have the airwaves used is a career ender now in Washington? That is how corrupt the system has gotten. That is dollarocracy. That's a case study of what we mean by dollarocracy, exactly that situation, that it's off the board. It can't even be talked about. No matter how popular it is, it can't be talked about. Since then, it's been pretty much hopeless to make reform within the system. The great Michael Copps, a dear friend of ours who fought hard as a member of the SEC, I don't even think he bothered to raise the issue. He just knew it was just not there was nowhere to go with it. It's off the table in Washington, D.C. today. It just can't happen. And that's one of the reasons we wrote this book. Now, finally, I ought to say a couple words. The good news, of course, is there's the internet. And we all have our smartphones. We all love the internet in here. And the great thing about the internet, what it serves is that it means that everyone in America loves this one idea. If you have a social problem, a political problem, an economic problem, you love to have a technology that solves it for you so you don't have to do anything differently. You don't have to have a new policy. You don't have to do the messy stuff of politics. You don't have to do the work of organizing. You just let the technology magically solve it. And the internet was supposed to do that for our elections. The internet was supposed to make it a magical solution, that we'd all be equal. We could get the same information. And we could use that to inexpensively get what we needed to participate in politics. It would give candidates who didn't have money behind them the ability to have access to voters and to give them a fair shot. It would solve our problem for us. That was the promise of the internet. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. It hasn't worked out that way. And not that the internet hasn't done and cannot do phenomenal things. We talk about that in the book. But the internet has also been turned on its head in the past 20 years. Instead of we're all being anonymous people in competitive markets working, anonymous people looking at the information, having the power to control the internet environment, small entrepreneurs challenging big businesses, dissidents be able to challenge people in power across the world, it's been turned on its head. The power has been turned to those who control it, not those of us who use it. And we see that in the emergence of a number of enormous monopolistic corporations that now dominate the internet. If you go through the list of the 30 largest companies in America, publicly traded companies, 14 or 15 of them are internet companies, internet-related companies. You know their names. Most, not all of them. A couple of them are behind-the-scenes companies like Qualcomm, but most of them you know their names. Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, right on down the list. And these companies are, by economic terms, monopolies. But they tend to have 50, 60, 70, 80% of the market share in their core area, which economists call monopoly. They can control who's in it, who's out. They basically dominate the market. In fact, a majority of those companies have equal to or greater market share than John D. Rockefeller had with Standard Oil at his prime back in the 19th century. These are powerhouse companies, and they dominate policymaking. This is dollarocracy in action. Only 3 of the 35 largest companies in America are those too big to fail banks that everyone knows owns the government. 15 are internet-related companies. So they rule the board. And why this is important is that these companies they've got their eyeballs right on that median money election complex. They've got their eyeballs on that $10 billion. They want that money, and they're working hard to get it. They want to bring that right into their system. How are they going to do that? Since we control the internet, we do everything, right? We can see what's going on. They can't manipulate us. Well, this is where it changes. This is where the smart advertising comes back. Now what we all know is they know everything about us. And they know everything, where you go, what you do, what you like, what words work with you to sell you something. There's nothing secret from them. And they're selling you to advertisers all the time. And with that information, they're going to change and revolutionize the way politics is practiced in this country. And interestingly enough, arguably, I'll just say arguably, I can't say definitively, you know who probably the one organization has the most information on Americans, online and offline combined? It's not the NSA. It's not Google. It's not Facebook. You know who it probably is? The Obama 2012 presidential campaign. That's not a joke. Read our book. We have a chapter on it. The Obama 2012 presidential campaign spent several $100 million putting together 2,000 of the best computer scientists in America. They put all their data, which had been in like 10 or 20 or 30 different data sets, on one cloud together and got the best supercomputers in the world, the best scientists in the world to play with it and massage it. And they came up with ways that they had between 1,200 and 2,000 points of information on every voter in America. They connect, commercial companies usually keep the demographic information separate from your actual name. They theoretically aren't supposed to know it. Obama, of course, the exact first thing they do is put the name connected. They broke down that barrier at 100 miles an hour. They knew exactly who all that data was connected to, and they worked it. And the Romney campaign and the Republicans are convinced that's the primary reason Obama was able to win the election. That was the leading factor, that they completely dominated with their digital strategy compared to Romney. And they said, we won't be caught short in 2014. We're going to do it. And I don't want to say anything more about this because there's a lot that could be said when we write about it, but I just want to give you a taste of what this means when we talk about knowing data and they can personalize messages to people and perfect them. What it means for a candidate, what they can do is, everyone in this room, if I were a candidate, I could send each of you messages, communicate with each of you, and I could send you messages to tell each of you the issue I care about is the issue that I can know you care the most about. I can put it in terms you'll like, present my position as one you'll like. To each of you can get completely contradictory messages, but you'll never know because you're the only one who's going to get the message. And no one can police it. Journalists can't police negative advertising now that's completely fraudulent. When those ads are up in the air, you can actually record them and look at them. How are they going to police 500 million emails that are sent out in a 2-day period or in a 1-week period, one at a time to individuals? They can't. We're entering a very scary period that way for politics. The money and media election complex is heading in directions that might make the days of negative ads look good. Believe it or not, that might be 2012, our next book might be The Golden Age of American Politics. What happened to it? That could be our possibility. Now, you're probably saying, how can Bob and John, we were presented as optimists, right? Remember that, Craig? What sort of who's the pessimist then? I hate to see that person. They'd be on a ledge. We are optimists. And I'm going to tell you quickly, and I'm going to let John handle it then. We're optimists for a very simple reason. I don't think this is a country where the political system accurately reflects the values of people in this country. I think the American people are deeply concerned about democracy. I think they have a lot of they want to get involved. I think the people are here and the political system, drenched in money, as Bernie documented, is way over here. And there's a huge gap there. The numbers are on our side. We can win. I'll tell you how you know the numbers are on our side. They're obsessed with being able to buy elections on one hand, and they're obsessed with suppressing the vote of people who won't vote for them on the other hand. That tells you they know something. They know they can't win a fair fight. I like those numbers. I like knowing if we have a fair fight, my side's probably going to win. And that's absolutely the case. They know that. They've known it all along. We got to remember that too. If we do, we'll win. Thank you very much.
Bob McChesney. Bob McChesney. I like the lighting in here because I don't have to actually look at you. I can see, I know many of you are beautiful, but at this point, I feel a little bit like I'm being interrogated. And I think that the question that's being asked is, despite that feeble attempt at the close of Bob's speech, what was this bogus line from Craig Aaron about optimism? Because we've just detailed a circumstance that sounds dramatically unaddressable. I mean, let's be realistic, Bob. I mean, nice little line at the end there about the numbers being on our side, but what came of that, right? The fact of the matter is we've had the numbers on our side many times. And we well know we never win. The people never prevail. Nobody ever listens to the people. They have no power, except when they said we maybe shouldn't go to war in Syria. Except when they said, well, maybe Larry Summers shouldn't ought to be the head of the Federal Reserve. Except, that's the interesting thing. Every once in a while, the people win. And sometimes they win big. I want to emphasize to you, 3 weeks ago, if you gathered the smartest people in Washington and put them on this panel here, they would have told you within a matter of hours, perhaps days, we will be bombing Syria. It's a given because we live in a monarchy. And in a monarchy, when the king or president or whatever we call him decides to go to war, we go to war. It's as simple as that. That's a given. That's understood. Well, yes, there was a constitution once, and it did say Congress has to declare war, but that's old-fashioned stuff. We don't do that anymore. We want to have a war, we have a war. President feels like a war, we go do it. That was 3 weeks ago. And then, interesting thing happened. And this is the only way to understand this. The only way to understand why we're not bombing Syria tonight is because, of course, our media, which has never, the one thing you can guess, you'd be absolutely certain of, is that Judith Miller remains the absolute touchstone for quality media coverage of wars, the reference point. And our media will tell you that Vladimir Putin came along, and that's why things changed. No, totally wrong. They'll say maybe Barack Obama had a change of heart. No, that didn't happen. What actually happened is we realized, again, the genius of the Bush White House. And the genius of the Bush White House is that they actually knew how to sell product, unlike most White Houses. In August of 2002, my man, Dick Cheney, he went, my kid's going to college based on a Cheney biography, so don't laugh. It's called Dick. That's the shortened title. But my man, Dick Cheney, went to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention in 2002, and Dick Cheney got up there and he gave this big wampum speech about how Iraq's going to have to be dealt with. And not a single person at that convention didn't get the impression that President Cheney had, in fact, declared war. And the guy, Cheney, got back to the White House, and you realize that this was the toughest job anybody ever had. Andrew Card, who was a high-ranking guy in the White House, had to go to Dick Cheney and say, you know, Dick, and this is in some of the wonderful books written, what we do now in media is after we do something really dumb, journalists then tell us we did something dumb. They never tell us before so we could avoid it. But after we went to war, we found out, that Card went to Cheney and he said, Dick, actually said, Mr. President, we don't roll product out in August, right? We don't try out new products in August. You do that in September. He said, well, why was that? Because, again, this is a fascinating thing. They didn't explain that in a lot of the books and a lot of discussions. The reason you don't put new product out, like the product being a war that nobody in their right mind would want, in August is because members of Congress aren't in Washington. They're back in their districts. And the interesting thing about the money and media election complex is that while it does define our politics at election time, when we're not in an election, the only place it actually works very well is in Washington, D.C., because the enforcers of the process, the lobbyists, the money people, the pundits, the whole of a money and media election complex, after they've gone out and bought the country, they retire back to Washington to run it, right? And there's only about 1 month a year where they're not actually kind of just holding the hands of members of Congress, walking them through the process. And that's August, when the money and media election complex goes to Rehoboth Beach and lets congressmen go back to their districts. Members of the Senate go back to their districts. And so when President Obama said in August, well, kind of feeling like we may have to do a little military intervention in Syria, the members of Congress weren't in Washington. And when the media, did dutifully ginned up its discussion about all this and how this is going to happen. In fact, literally saying it's only a matter of time, and actually having one of the more charming and reassuring discussions ever in American media, which is whether President Obama would need to rush the military intervention so that he could do it before the G20 summit. And if you remember back 3 weeks ago, that was the discussion. Well, he's got to get it in on Saturday there. Could we schedule the war Saturday, Sunday? I don't know. It's inconvenient. Labor Day is coming on. We want to, but you can't really declare war when you're touring Europe. And they were having calendar scheduling discussions about when we would go to war because it was so necessary. And indeed, it was about serious issues. Let us not neglect that crisis on the ground, horrible things happening in Syria. No doubt about that. But the question of whether this was the right answer. Now, in Washington, it was the right answer. War is always the right answer, right? Military-industrial complex. President Eisenhower got that one right. But out in America, people were like, ixnay on the our way thing. They like, no, we didn't want to go there. And members of Congress would, in August, they go to like church basements and county fairs and coffee shops where real people are. And the interesting thing was that every place they went, the real people said, no, don't do this. And they said, well, yeah, you see, but we gotta, because people said, no, don't do this. And it became a real problem. People like Congressman Mark Pocan would go to White House briefings and official briefings, and he'd come out and he'd say, none of the questions that people are asking me at home have been answered. I'm not on board. I'm not down with this. People like Senator Sanders said, I got a feeling that if we go to war, we might not have a very good discussion about expanding education or creating jobs in this country. And that started to bubble up to the White House, and give President Obama immense credit. He's a constitutional law professor. Went back to the document. He said, there is this thing about consulting Congress. Hadn't seen it. It's interesting. Now, of course, he said in his press conference, if you'll recall, said, I believe I have the power to just go to war if I want to. I don't know where he got that idea, but I believe I got the power to go to war if I want to, but it's a constitutional democracy, so I'm going to consult Congress. Very interesting thing, because suddenly, when you consult Congress, you open up a space. And into that space, right? Into that space step the American people. Polling showing that 60, 70, depending on what you start talking about, boots on the ground, 80, 90% of Americans did not want to go to war. And no matter what they did, no matter what they talked about, it just didn't move the needle. That poor McDermott guy, what we see on like every talk show, and the needle would not move. And suddenly, when the needle didn't move, instead of having a congressional vote that the president might have lost, an interesting thing asserted itself: the alternative to war. Democracy forcing us to actually look at alternatives to war. We're not bombing Syria. It's not about Vladimir Putin. It's because for a brief period there, one of those rare moments, the American people actually were heard. And when the American people are actually heard, good things happen. American people aren't to be frightened. They shouldn't be scared of them. They're not a dangerous bunch of folks. They're actually quite reasonable. If you picked 435 of them and made the Congress, we'd actually be a pretty decent country. You could put Pocan in, too. We'd be 436. But here's the interesting thing. Once we averted a war and replaced it with diplomacy, which might actually solve the real problem on the ground, get rid of those chemical weapons, actually protect human beings from being so badly harmed by their own government. Once we did that, do you know what our media said to us in America? They said, well, you understand what happened here. Because the media pundits are fantastic at explaining what happened after it happens. You understand what happened here? The American people are war weary. See, American people love a war. Don't get us wrong here. Nothing they love more than a good war. But they're tired. Now, maybe they'll get a good night's rest. We can do a war tomorrow. Maybe they'll go to the beach or on vacation, kind of really, maybe they'll unplug their cell phones, turn off the computer for a few days, go swimming, play with the kids, really have kind of a nice time off, and then they'll be relaxed and they'll be ready for a war. Because, they're war weary, they're tired. We can, get them back there. Well, the media was totally wrong. The American people weren't war weary. The American people were war wary. Take the E out of there. Get rid of that extra letter. They were skeptical. They were doubtful. Because while official Washington, so slathered in money, so slathered in spin, it can never learn. But the American people actually evolved. They progressed. They learned. And the American people out there in this country of theirs, their country, they watched the last 10, 12 years. And they asked themselves, do all these wars we've been fighting, have they made the world a better place? Have we progressed? Has something good come of this? Did they work the way they told us? Were we greeted, as Dick Cheney said, were we greeted as liberators in Iraq? I mean, have we solved all the problems of Afghanistan? Have we made the world a substantially better place? I'm not telling you, I wish I could stand here being as brave as a pacifist. No, I'm telling you that there are times when wars are necessary. There are times when wars achieve a good end, or at least as good an end as is possible. But the experience of the last 12 years for Americans is one that made them very wary, very skeptical about wars. Not war-weary, war-wary. And you know what's funny about that? That's exactly what the founders intended. The American Constitution worked the way it is supposed to work. Because in 1787, when fewer people than are in this room tonight, fewer people than are here tonight, wrote the American Constitution and voted it into being in that little tiny room in Philadelphia, they had had the experience in this country of a king. They had fought a revolution against that king. And the reason they got mad at the king was because kings in Europe and czars and kaisers, they kept getting mad at their cousins. They could not get along with their family. And so they would have wars. And when the King of England got mad at the czar or the kaiser, he started a war and then he taxed the Americans. They did not like to send their tax money off. But they actually put up with that for a while. But then kings started to offshore wars. Now, I know some of you are familiar with offshoring. That's where your jobs went. But the King of England offshored the French and Indian War to America. He sent it to America. And the American people are saying, hold it. This is too much. We pay for these wars, and then you send it over here, you make us fight it, and then you fight it on our soil. This is really crazy. If we just X you out of the system, we don't have to pay our taxes for stupid wars, and we don't have to fight them on our soil anymore. And if you want to understand, everybody, I love Boston Tea Party, the Stamp Act, stuff like that. You want to read the real history of the American Revolution, you understand people were war-weary. They wanted to get out of that game. And when they wrote a constitution in 1787, George Mason, not a basketball team, but a human being, George Mason, essential author of the Constitution, said, we wrote this document to constrain rather than facilitate war. We wanted to limit rather than facilitate power to go to war. And so they made it very complicated. They sent it to Congress, and as we all know, Congress can't do anything. Certainly can't do it well, and so it's going to be slow and ponderous and difficult. And the end result is, almost 250 years after they wrote that document, for reasons not all noble, not all easy, it worked. That's an incredible thing. Now, I don't think the founders were geniuses. I don't think they were perfect. Tom Paine was a genius, but they didn't let him help write the Constitution. But I think that the founders of the American experiment had this wonderful opportunity. They got to sit around and think about how you made a country that would work, how you might do it right. Now, they did a lot of stuff wrong. They compromised. They did the original sin of the American experiment, saying people of color were 3/5 of human beings. They did fundamentally flawed things. And you know what? A lot of them knew they did flawed things. Jefferson was no fool. He knew slavery was wrong. They knew they did wrong things. They made compromises that were inappropriate. So they did one thing that was very important. They put at the end of that Constitution, they wove into it the ability to amend it. And they said something that was really important. That some of what we do today will be useful to you 250 years from now. But much of what we do today will be rooted in the moment when we live. And it will be useless to you. It could even be damaging to you. Thomas Jefferson said, James Madison, his colleague, the essential author of the Constitution, agreed. The most dangerous thing one generation could do to another is hand them off a Constitution and tell them it was written in stone. Tell them it was biblical, that you could not ever alter this document. The most dangerous thing you can do, says, as they said, because one generation would end progress. The country would never go forward because it would be all rules, all ideas, everything would be locked in one generation. You had to amend the document. The American people confirmed that. The document was written in 1787. The American people refused to enact it. It could not get the approval of the states. Founders were forced to go back and write 10 amendments to the Constitution. People say, oh, the Constitution, you can't mess with the Constitution. Don't touch that thing. The people that wrote the damn thing amended it 10 times in 4 years. They said, oh, we got some things wrong here. We're going to change some things. They amended again. They kept amending it very often in the early years of the Republic. And in fact, we've amended our Constitution 27 times since the founding of the American experiment. There's a reason for that. Because just as those 36 or so people who gathered in 1787 to write a Constitution understood, Americans have understood at critical points in our history that we must refound the Republic. We have to answer the challenges of the moment to make right the future. And I'll tell you, brothers and sisters, this is not a complicated thing. We are at such a moment. Every depressing thing that Bob McChesney said, and it was tragic. I mean, let us be honest here. I mean, this was a nightmarish walk. I mean, this is a dystopia, right? There's nothing as bad as what Bob McChesney just described. I am sorry. Each moment that passes, I become more annoyed by that pathetic attempt at optimism at the end of your speech. I mean, billionaires coming back every year. It's just, oh, I spent $1 billion, I'll spend another $1 billion. I mean, and a media that's just stood down, it's non-existent. Bob doesn't even tell the scary stories. They tell in the book, it's one of my favorite stories. In 2010 in Illinois, the entire media stood down. They didn't cover the race for lieutenant governor, the number 2 job in the state. Democratic primary in this very democratic state. They nominate for lieutenant governor this guy who's a pawn shop owner who had a lot of money. He spent $2 million. Everybody else in the primary was broke. And they didn't pay any attention to it. Guy gets nominated. Somebody finally, after, calls up, where the paper says, you realize that you've nominated for lieutenant governor of the state the guy who's been accused of, some pretty unbelievably atrocious wife beating. But there may be an explanation for it because it could be his drug problem. And I mean, it's just unbelievable stuff, right? I mean, just the story. Once they told the story, it was like, whoa. And so they had weeks of crisis because this guy was, locked into the Democratic ticket. He's finally, talked into leaving it and stuff. But it created a political crisis in the state. And we detail in the book, the Chicago Tribune, and Chicago Sun-Times, major papers in the state said, ooh, guess we should have covered that one. Well, and you think, well, that only in Illinois could that happen. Except in South Carolina, they nominated for the U.S. Senate some guy who, by all accounts, as best anybody could figure out, just had a name that sounded good. And then he got nominated, and again, whoa. The post-election stories were unbelievable. Problem with this situation is, again, you're supposed to tell people about this stuff before they vote, not after. And we found example after example after example of a media that had stood down a dysfunctional precedent. Bob was generous with you. It's far worse. We found, look, in California, they spent $550 million last year on referendums. Everybody wants organic food. Everybody wants organic food, but California voted against organic food. I mean, this is reality. The money is so powerful, it's definitional. And this is what's happened in America. We've created a circumstance where media has stood down, money has stood up. The Supreme Court of the United States, on a regular basis, whatever reform is put forward, is torn apart and pushed aside. The possibility of a reform getting passed and then being approved by this Supreme Court, a meaningful reform of money in politics, is absolutely 100% zero. It will not happen. No reform can go up to this court and survive. The court's made it clear. There's no doubt of that. And so we ask ourselves, it's not, Bob doesn't begin to tell you how bad it is. And then you say, well, what do we do in this moment? Well, it's like when you throw that little bottle there and you put a note in it. The founders said very, very clearly, said if this document, if these structures don't work for you, fix them, repair them. The United States of America needs a constitutional amendment to say money is not speech, corporations are not people, and we, the people, have a right to renew our democracy by controlling money in politics. That is an absolute realism. That is a necessity. We must do that, not some distant time in the future. We have to do that now if we're going to have our politics back. But not enough, brothers and sisters. That's not enough, just getting the money out. No. They meddle with our vote. We have a Supreme Court of the United States that literally says we've got to get more money and fewer votes. So we have to amend our Constitution to say that every American has a right to vote and a right to have that vote counted. No more meddling with the Voting Rights Act. You have a right to vote and a right to have that vote counted. And while we're at it, we have a responsibility to eliminate the Electoral College. Because George Bush wasn't elected president in 2000, and neither was Dick Cheney. The fact of the matter is they lost by 540,000 votes, and yet an archaic structural mistake from the founding of the American experiment allowed for the loser in the presidential election to become the president of the United States. That can never happen again. These are a whole bunch of constitutional amendments. That's a lot of stuff we're asking for. And I know what you're saying right now. Mr. Nichols, it's a pleasure to hear these wonderful words. It's great that you have taken us out of the abyss into which McChesney led us and are beginning to show us a bit of light and possibility here. But of course, anything good is impossible. Constitutional amendments cannot be achieved. It's totally undoable. How could we possibly do that? Never happened before. Never had a bad moment in this country and we amended our way out of it. No, except 100 years ago. 100 years ago in this country, in America, if you woke up and looked out across the fertile plain, what you saw was a country where in Milltown after Milltown, little girls, 6, 7-year-old girls, did not get up in the morning and put their American Girl doll aside and put their backpack on and run off to school. They didn't go to school. They went to a mill. And those little 6 and 7-year-old girls had a job in the mill. They ran up and down amidst these huge machines, these textile machines. And if a bobbin fell off or if it ran out, it was their job to get in there and put another bobbin on. Because their fingers were so little and they were so small, they could get in among the machinery and change the bobbins. And sometimes that machine wasn't fully stopped. Sometimes it kept running. And maybe it chopped a little girl's finger off or her hand. She was permanently crippled. But that's okay because she's just a little girl and they're expendable. She wasn't an actual worker. That's just what she did in child labor 100 years ago in the United States of America, not Bangladesh, America. And if that little girl grew to age, if she got to be 17, 18, 19 years old, then she went to work in a mill. Maybe she went to work in a textile factory. If she lived in one of our big cities, maybe she worked in a tall building on the top floor making shirts or pants. And maybe she was working there with her Italian and her Irish and her Jewish and her African Americans coming up from the South, fellow workers, all working together in this, trying to make just a little money, help the family survive because it was Gilded Age. You had immense wealth and immense poverty. So you had to work hard day in, day out. And maybe when the fire started in the factory and the girls, young women ran for the doors, they found them barred, locked shut, so nobody could go down to safety. And so they had to make the choice to jump out those windows to their death. One woman after another dying, falling on the floor, on the ground in New York City, outside the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. That was America 100 years ago. When workers tried to organize their unions, they were mowed down with automatic weapons. And those who killed them were not prosecuted. That was America 100 years ago. And you know those women who worked in those plants, they couldn't organize a union. They couldn't even vote. We barred women from voting. And if they could vote, they couldn't elect their U.S. Senate because our U.S. Senate was appointed in backroom deals with bribes, not elected. And even if we had an elected Congress reflective of the people's will, that Congress could not tax or regulate corporations in any kind of meaningful way because we didn't have an internal revenue service. We didn't have a tax system in this country that was functional for the purpose of taxing the wealthy, taxing corporations, beginning to move money in any kind of way, beginning to put power, some kind of power in the government to actually regulate economic power. It had none of that. That was 100 years ago. 10 years later, in the United States of America, we had child labor laws. State after state was passing laws to protect women in the workplace. Unions were starting to organize. We were outlining the basic premises of what would become the New Deal in this country. Everything was changing, and changing for the better. There were still problems, huge problems, but we were having fundamental change in this country. What had happened in those 10 years? We amended the Constitution of the United States to say that women could vote. We amended the Constitution of the United States to say that our Senate would be elected, not appointed. We amended the Constitution of the United States to create an internal revenue service and to allow us to tax the rich. We fundamentally changed this country in a 10-year period. Now, I know that what you're saying is, well, of course, but those people were better than we are. Those people were dramatically more interesting and smart and good-looking. And I would just remind you that many of them were your ancestors, so don't begin to think that they were all that much better than you. And yet, they did, and I'll tell you something else about them. They lived in a gilded age where money was, you had an immense gap between rich and poor. Our media served the wealthy. It was sensationalist. We had all kinds of problems. And you know what the most interesting thing about it is? The most interesting thing about it is those people worked longer hours than most of us do today. So they would work 8, 10, 12, 14 hours, and then they would go to a meeting, and they would say, we got to amend the Constitution of the United States. And somebody would say, oh, that's impossible. And they'd say, well, it can't be, because if it can't amend the Constitution of the United States, we're stuck here. We will live like this forever. And I don't think I want my daughter to lose her finger in a machine. And I don't think I want my sister to have to jump out of an 11th or 12th floor window to her death. And I don't think I want it to be this way anymore. Well, brothers and sisters, it's a simple equation. We write about this in great detail. We go into all this in the book because we believe we've reached that critical juncture where it is necessary to amend the Constitution of the United States. But Bob and I are late to the story. We didn't get there in time. We're just like the reporters we criticize who tell you about things after they happen. Because you know what's fascinating is it's already happening in America. The fact of the matter is the most dynamic movement in the United States of America today is the movement to overturn Citizens United and to amend the Constitution of the United States. 16 American states have formally petitioned Congress to enact an amendment to the Constitution to overturn Citizens United. More than 500 communities from the East Coast to the West Coast, urban and rural, have formally petitioned for a constitutional amendment to overturn the Citizens United ruling and to say money is not speech, corporations are not people. And that's just the start of it. There are dynamic movements afoot to do a constitutional amendment to say that the right to vote must be put in our Constitution. People have a right to vote and to have it counted. Things are actually happening in this country. Unfortunately, we don't have a media that covers politics. We have a media that tells us what the weather's going to be tomorrow. And they tell us what the temperature is in Virginia and in Maryland, and in this side of Washington and that side of Washington. If they would just give us one temperature a day, they'd have plenty of time to tell us about popular movements that might change the country. But the fact of the matter is, it's there and it's happening. And I would love to close this speech on the highest note I possibly could. But I can't do it. I can't close this speech on the highest note that I possibly could. I can tell you that we will amend our Constitution. I can tell you that in the next 10 years, we will change and repair this country. We will make it happen. Because we're starting from a stronger point now than they were at in 1910. We have bigger and better movements right now to do the fundamental reforms than they had in 1910. I'll tell you that we're going to do it. There is simply no question.